The ultimate goal here tonight is to elicit feedback from the UAC and get your input. Our goal is to take back a business plan to the council this fall. But again, the work that we're doing is preparatory in terms of developing what we think that business plan should be ultimately. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Steve Blum. Steve, as I said, is a veteran of the telecommunications industry, particularly in the wireless area. He's worked with communities before, especially in California, in developing broadband plans. And Steve's going to cover the market research that has been conducted about what we do presently and recommendations for the future.
Thank you, Jim. Commissioners, we conducted a market research study here in Palo Alto with several objectives. One was to take a look at what the current network does, who it serves, and who it doesn't serve. We looked at the cost benefit of extending the network. We looked at the way the service is priced and at possible alternatives for pricing. We looked at lit services, in other words, adding value to the dark fiber. And then finally, we took a look at the current state of the fiber to the premise or the fiber to the home market. We had findings and recommendations. Starting out with, we found that the city's fiber optic service has a high market awareness within the city, particularly within the market segment that it serves, which is typically companies that have high broadband bandwidth needs. The core competency of the city is just basically providing reliable, inexpensive connectivity, dark fiber between point A and point point B is usually PAX in downtown Palo Alto. The city has been very effective in covering the core market areas where most users are concentrated, those being Stanford Research Park in the downtown area. There are some gaps in coverage of commercial areas, and I'll get into that in more detail in a moment. There's about 5 areas where the network doesn't get to that are, or at least appeared to be 5 areas initially, of business clusters that are unserved. There's other potential market segments out there that could be served, large commercial properties, for example, and cellular telephone companies. We had some recommendations in terms of marketing. As I said, the city does a very good job, but we think that a fairly low-level, targeted marketing, ongoing marketing campaign could help keep awareness up. There's turnover in the high-tech business. People come, people go, and just, I think, a maintenance-level marketing program would help keep the city services in front of its potential customers. We recommend considering extending the network to at least 2 or 3 new areas, and I'll get into the details on that. It would be based either on the potential return on investment, and we did an analysis of that. There's also an economic development case to be made in a couple of circumstances. That's really a policy question rather than an economic analysis question, though. As I said, growth opportunities exist, including for large commercial properties and mobile carriers. We've suggested some programs to address them, and we recommend pursuing those segments. We do not recommend providing lit services and moving up the value chain. The companies that provide those services are, in fact, the city's best customers, and they do a good job of offering those services out there. There does not appear to be a compelling reason to go into competition with those customers. Flat rate pricing is a strategy that we're recommending, particularly where some of the outlying areas of the city are concerned, and it's also potentially a plus for mobile telephone companies. Fiber to the basement was actually Josh Wallace's term. I thought it was a good one, so I stole it. And I'll get into more of what that entails, but it's a good strategy for large commercial properties, potentially providing high bandwidth services to companies that may not be able to afford or have need of a full-fledged dark fiber pipeline, but could benefit from having it available in their building. And then finally, in terms of fiber to the home, this is another case where we found no compelling business case to move ahead with it. This is based on the current state of the market in the Bay Area and nationally, and what's going on in the industry. But after looking at it, we concluded there is no particular reason, no compelling reason to go forward with a fiber to the home project at this time. Research started by taking the city's electric utility, electric customer database, in particular the commercial accounts, and breaking them up into 5 categories based on the amount of annual electricity usage and the type of account. They were sorted into 5 different categories. Then those categories were matched against the current fiber customers, and a profile, an electric usage profile of the fiber customers was developed. And that let us do a couple of things. It let us first map the reach of the current network, and we found that if you look at the current network and the businesses, the large electric users who are within 200 meters of the network, you have very good coverage. And I'll backtrack just a second here. When we did the profiling to match electric usage to the fiber accounts, we made an assumption that turned out to hold in the majority of cases. In fact, the vast majority of cases, we made an assumption that high electric usage corresponds to, or rather high broadband usage corresponds to high electric usage. In other words, if you're pushing a lot of bits down the pipeline, you're probably burning a lot of electricity to do that. And in fact, that turned out to be the case when we looked at the fiber customer database. It doesn't necessarily hold the other way. If you're a large electric user, you may not have big bandwidth needs. For example, a bakery or a laundry or most retail operations wouldn't need high amounts of bandwidth, but they do burn electricity. But this was a starting point. So most of the customers, your electric customers, commercial electric accounts that use a lot of electricity, are already within reach of the network. And in fact, the 2 major clusters, downtown Palo Alto and Stanford Research Park, are essentially 100% covered. That I think is that might be the 50-meter contour that's up there, but it's 200 meters, 50 meters. It's all within a reasonable drop length. You have the major areas of the city very well covered. We found that the accounts, the prospective fiber customers, the potential fiber customers out there, are about roughly evenly divided up into 3 groups: Stanford Research Park, downtown Palo Alto, and the rest of the city. Then when you look at them as a whole, you'll find, first of all, 44% are probably, of the heavy electric users, are probably not prospects for high capacity bandwidth connections. These are mostly retail operations, a variety of other types of businesses. We did go out and talk to some retail operations to double check that. The demand for a single store for high capacity bandwidth of the sort that Palo Alto provides, the demand just isn't there for the most part. So roughly 44% of the market of the high electric users, commercial electric users, really aren't prospective customers. About a third, 32% of the high electric users out there, though, are customers, potential fiber customers that are either already fiber customers or have been evaluated for service. In other words, the city has done a very good job at reaching out to potential customers. 32% of the high electric usage accounts, again, have either signed up for service or have, in most cases, have gone through the formal process of getting a bid or at least a preliminary estimate of what it would cost to hook up to the network. That indicates that they are aware of it, that they understand the pluses and minuses. They've evaluated the business case, and it's either right or wrong for them. But from a marketing perspective, that's very good market penetration. Of the remaining 23%, it's roughly broken up into 2 groups. One is large commercial properties that use large amounts of electricity, and the other is generally technical, medical, and professional organizations, operations that are very similar to the 32% that have already evaluated service. When you then look at the other side of the coin, in other words, where the customers are that you're not reaching, the question asked is really, are there any clusters of customers out there that aren't within about 200 meters of the network? The answer came back initially, there looked like there were about 5 clusters. The biggest one is along El Camino Real. There's another one over in the Welch Road, Sand Hill Road area that looked very promising. A smaller one on San Antonio Avenue, a rather compact, dense one over on East Meadow Circle, and then a small one on East Bayshore. We did a cost-benefit analysis of extending the network to those 5 locations. And the conclusions were, first of all, the area over on San Antonio Avenue really wasn't a cluster. It turned out to be 2 businesses, one of whom has already looked at service. That would be, if there was interest there, it could certainly be extended to them, but it's not something that we think ought to be done prospectively. The area on East Meadow Circle, on the other hand, looks like a slam dunk. And in fact, city staff is already moving ahead with extending service to that area. There's a number of companies around that area. They've already investigated service. And that project, as it turned out, is already underway. So that was one where the city anticipated the results of the study pretty well. Another area that has high promise is over on Welch Road. A lot of medical facilities are over there. Medicine is an increasingly large consumer of bandwidth generally, and extending the city's network to that area could be very beneficial both to the customers out there and to the city itself. There's enough customers out there that they could be contacted, perhaps letters of interest obtained in advance. It could be done on a fairly low-risk basis. Then in the middle you have East Bayshore, which is kind of a small area, and then El Camino Real. Those are generally areas that don't have large high-tech businesses. There are commercial properties there, large commercial properties, and if a program were developed to address them, then it could be very beneficial to extend service out there. In general, though, they tend to be retail customers along those routes, particularly El Camino Real. And it would to extend it along El Camino Real in the long run could be beneficial, but it would be speculative at this point. It could be beneficial from an economic development perspective. It should make that area more attractive to higher tech businesses, but in that case, you'd be leading the market, not following it. Then we looked at pricing. One of the things we looked at was the potential for flat rate pricing. Right now, the dark fiber services are priced on the basis of a customer's distance, primarily on a customer's distance from downtown Palo Alto. So people in downtown Palo Alto, pay very little, relatively, in I think $600 or $700 a month range, whereas people farther out on the network, for example in Stanford Research Park or in the northeast part of the city, pay much more in the $2,000, $2,500 a month range. So we looked at the potential impact of flat rate pricing. We looked at what would happen if you set a flat rate at various price points, and a price point of $1,400, a total of $1,610 because there's currently a flat $210 a month drop fee. A flat rate of $1,400 a month for the service looked to be a sweet spot. At that rate, you're going to lose, if you extended that rate to all your current customers that are paying more than $1,400 a month, you'd lose about 10% in revenue, but it could be made up with a couple dozen new customers. And it would bring in a large area in the east of the city particularly that it may not be economically attractive to under the current pricing plan. It's a large part of Stanford Research Park which is one of your primary areas, and then of course the northwest area of the city and along El Camino Real. Another thing we looked at again was a fiber to the basement model, and what we considered there was the possibility of working either directly with a property owner or with a third-party reseller, telecommunication services reseller, who would work with a property owner to extend a fiber line to a building, to a central point in the building, and then basically become an ISP, an internet service provider, providing high-speed bandwidth throughout the building. We did a business case evaluation of that, looked at several different scenarios, and in all cases in the scenarios, it pencils out pretty well. In fact, in this case, it's not really a question of a flat rate, but it's more of a question of being able to overcome that initial capital cost of pulling the fiber to the boundaries of the property line. And what we looked at doing there was a potential of increasing the flat rate by $200 a month in those cases, and using that money to pay for the pay over time the capital cost of extending the network. Based on the average lifetime of a subscriber, it pencils out over a number of different scenarios, and the details are in the report. There are several areas where there are high concentrations of large commercial properties, and those are, in fact, either your prime locations downtown in Stanford Research Park, or the areas where we've looked at extending the network: El Camino Real, Welch Road, and over around East Bayshore and in that vicinity. And finally, we looked at fiber to the home. In this case, we looked at what's going on, not just with fiber particularly, because it's really a question of service and not technology. We looked at what overbuilders, in other words, companies that come in and build networks on top of the incumbent cable company and the incumbent phone company, what overbuilders do and what their prospects are looking forward, but more importantly, what their history has been. There are a few stars out there, some success stories in the fiber to the home market. Bristol, Virginia, Cedar Falls, Iowa are two good examples. They're isolated rural communities, though, compared to Palo Alto in any event. They have second-tier cable companies serving them. They've done very well for themselves. Their market conditions have made it such that municipally run networks have been a success in those markets. There are some systems where the book is still open. Sure West is actually not a municipal overbuilder. It's a private overbuilder. It's based up in Sacramento. It's done fairly well in Sacramento, but it's doing well in Sacramento on top of a network that it bought out of bankruptcy from the company that built it. It bought it out of bankruptcy for about a dime on the dollar. And with that kind of leverage, they've been able to make a go of it. However, they are not looking at expanding elsewhere in California. I've talked to the company about that. They are looking at Kansas. They acquired another overbuilder there, and they are looking at expanding their network in Kansas. In fact, in the same general part of Kansas that Google is doing their fiber to the home project. Another private overbuilder is Verizon. Technically, they're not an overbuilder. They're an incumbent telephone company, but they are building fiber services in many parts of the United States, or rather, they were building fiber services in many parts of the United States. Their construction program is more or less over. They've except for a handful of very small completion jobs, they have stopped investing in new plant. And then finally, there are a number of examples of municipally run fiber to the home or other types of broadband systems that have not made it in the marketplace, that have not been business successes. One particular example being Alameda, which, compared to the other cities at least, has a lot in common with Palo Alto. It's in the Bay Area. It has its own power utility. It competes against the same companies, AT&T and Comcast, that any third Palo Alto system would be competing against. That is a system that did not fare well. It was a hybrid fiber coax system, strictly speaking, not fiber to the home. But again, it's about the service, not the technology. That was a system that ran for a few years, and then they ended up having, because of financial losses, having to sell to Comcast for about 50 cents on the dollar. And then they ended up in court for several years after that. So the conclusion was that there really is no example out there that you can point to and say, this is where this city has succeeded, so Palo Alto can too. The successes don't have a lot in common with Palo Alto. The failures, to the extent they have similarities, or rather to the extent that they're comparable, do have similarities with Palo Alto, and that is really the biggest hurdle. Fiber to the home is expensive to build, and it can be expensive to operate. Under the current business models that the industry runs under, broadband systems are paid for by video revenue principally. There's no real example out there of a full-scale fiber to the home system that runs on internet revenue alone. So you have to get into the video game, and that's very tough. To make enough money to pay for the system and cover operating costs, you're going to have to get a high market penetration, likely in excess of 50%, with high monthly revenue per subscriber, probably in the $100 a month range, which is where the incumbents are. And that is not likely to happen in a competitive marketplace. So that is, those are my findings and my report. I guess we'll be taking questions later, but I thank you very much.